Welcome to today's session on compliance and auditing. My name is Nandini Ramani, and I run all the monitoring and observability services at AWS. And, I had an intro prepared with a lot of what are cloud operations and how observability fits into it, and the pillars of security and compliance. But after today's keynote and this really exciting conversation and discussion pre-panel earlier, I decided to switch it around a little so we can hear directly from our esteemed panelists. But I would like to reiterate a lot of points that you heard in the keynote this morning really resonate. How, humans and data don't mix, and I heard several stories already, and I'll let you discover it on your own. And also, one of the other things is, when you talk about compliance and security and other things, people generally think about compute, storage, databases, and you're off to the race, lifting and shifting from on-prem or wherever you are in your cloud journey. And typically, security, compliance, and other things come after the fact. How do you monitor? How do you continuously ensure that you're staying on top of it, et cetera? So that also is another aspect I'm hoping that we can unpack a little bit. And a third one is how it's not just about tooling and new services and checks and balances and things like that, but it's also you're dealing with human beings here. So you need good processes in place, you need training, and lots of those other aspects of it as well. So today, just like we do every time, we always tell our stories through the voice of the customer. And today, I have with me three esteemed panelists who I'm excited to have talked to you about compliance and auditing. I'd like to first introduce Nick Mistry, Vice President, Information Security, Technology Management at Fannie Mae. Nick, would you like to quickly introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. So Nick Mistry, I report into the CISO. My main function is within the information security architecture domain, architecting and building in security within the cloud and specifically our cloud environments, but also includes the control testing. So there's a validation aspect of it as well, and then AppSec and vulnerability management. And recently, one of the things that we are driving towards is creating unified vulnerability management function. So that's across AppSec, it's across infrastructure vulnerabilities, and then configuration management or control testing.
Great. Thanks, Nick. And we also have James Reid, JR, as we call him, CIO, Employee Experience and Corporate Technology. He's also a distinguished engineer from JPMorgan Chase. JR, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely, thank you. So I've been with the firm about 3 years now. So corporate technology, employee experience span pretty much the back office of the bank. So legal, audit, workforce tech, robotics. But then there's employee experience. So this is where JPMorgan Chase is really trying to create the same experience that's on the consumer side, also on the employee side. And part of that experience includes the engineers. So with my tech background, came up as an engineer, I lean in very heavily in how we think about the engineering experience as it pertains to the cloud, how we leverage the cloud, our data strategy. And that experience came from my previous company, Equifax. Yes, that's where the breach happened. No, the breach didn't happen in my area, to be very clear. But went on that journey of taking I own the strategic global platforms there and moving those workloads into the cloud. So brought that experience into JPMC, so we'll share a little bit of that experience.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. And last but not least, we have Carl Kubalsky. He's the Business Information Security Officer for John Deere. Carl?
Yeah, great. Nice to meet you and see you all. Carl Kubalsky. I've been with Deere for about 20 years. Grew up as an engineer myself. JR and I were talking about that. My current remit is really focused on our intelligent solutions and the builders at John Deere, those that are producing for us the products that are making our customers and our dealers successful. That includes things like application security, vulnerability management. Much like Nick, we're working to try to push app vulnerabilities and scanning vulnerabilities together. The remit also includes cloud security and our security of the products that we have, the intelligent and connected products that we have out in the field.
Great, thank you. So with that, let's get started. In talking to customers, we always hear from them that they have different reasons for compliance. And as you can see, we have 3 different industries here, some of them industries within industries in some cases. And just hearing, one of the things I'd love to hear is, where are you in this journey of cloud transition? And then how does compliance fit into it? And I don't mean just the fact that you have a checkbox item that says you have to meet certain regulations and things like that, but how does it impact your business? What do you see? So let's get started. Maybe you can kick us off, Nick.
Sure, absolutely. Obviously, compliance is incredibly important for us. One of the things we did very recently is we started anchoring on the NIST 853 controls baseline, mainly because that's a nice way to translate between just about any compliance framework. It is a framework. And having that line of sight back to a NIST control, and again, it's just a framework, but allows us to be consistent and allows us to be flexible in how we meet those control requirements. The other benefit is in writing it out based on those NIST controls, we can prioritize. We created this concept of P0s, P1s, so we know what are the most important set of controls. And then lastly, leveraging that framework, we're actually creating control requirements that map, but then implementation statements so that we can test against it. So now we have a fully automated way of making sure we're provisioning in all of our basic, I would say, control requirements, and then testing after the fact, testing in deployed environments, whether they're lower environments and in production, and that's one way we're managing to that.
I see a lot of nodding.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, I want to just set a little context just about just the scale of JPMC that we have to deliver at such a global scale, because it matters. So, we have, roughly 63 million households that we have relationships with, US households. 80% of Fortune 500 companies we do business with. Process over 8 trillion payments are processed daily. Roughly 55 million active digital customers, 31 trillion assets worldwide, and then 6,500 plus applications. And you're talking over 500 petabytes of data. It's a huge scale. And one of the things as we think about compliance and continuous compliance and how it can become a competitive advantage, what's most important for JPMorgan and Chase as we're on this journey is how do we achieve organizational agility? And that organizational agility is really about reducing technical and functional debt. The way I describe it is across 5 economic assets that's in the bank. 1, your organizational asset. How do you strategize, plan, and invest? Thinking lean budgets, thinking how more of an agile way of thinking is really an important part of this journey. 2, your technology assets, how you design, build, and operate your technology assets. And modernizing those applications. 3, our data assets. How do we leverage, democratize that data, and reuse that data in a way that's going to allow us to create new digital business models that's going to allow us to be able to compete. And then what's underpinning those 2 economic assets is security and compliance. That's where it's really important to JPMorgan and Chase. We have to get that right, because like with any company, like I experienced at Equifax, when an incident occurs, those incidents is more than just a monetary penalty that you incur for non-compliance. There's other costs. So you get increase in operational costs, you get investigative and litigation costs, reputational damage, and most importantly, we lose the loyalty of our customers. So making sure that we achieve organizational agility, allowing us to respond quickly, but at a low cost, so we can reimagine ourselves, building new products and new services, We have to do it with a thoughtfulness and with care to make sure we're getting the security and compliance piece of this right, making sure that we're protecting the bank and protecting our customers. And we're making a huge shift on our journey and how we think about that. And I will always say, and I think you'll see throughout the panel, moving into the cloud is an evolution. And you're going to constantly evolve. And you will look back, or you may join, when you join companies, as I join, you look and you say, why did we make that decision? There's always a context. But you want to just continue to evolve on that journey based on how much the organization can absorb change, and based on what you know at the moment, and also based on the talent that you have within the organization. But it's definitely a journey.
Wow. Two really well-spoken colleagues. I'm not sure how to follow that up, but for me, as I think about compliance in our industry, maybe a little context for the audience, I really look at the work that we do as three different industries. We have the traditional manufacturing industry that many know and see, big John Deere machines, green John Deere machines, and yellow John Deere machines. Many don't know that we also have a finance. We're part of the finance industry. With wholesale and retail credit products, we are regulated. Like a bank in many jurisdictions. And then there's a third element of our company, which is really focused on technology. This is things like autonomous tractors that don't have drivers in the cab, AI and ML that enable us to identify weeds in a field and spray only the weed, as opposed to broadcast application across the entire field. And as we think about those three different groups, there are obviously different compliance and regulatory pressures on our teams and differing levels of capability with AWS and the cloud. For me, what we try to do as much as possible is to pull that compliance toward the engineer, toward the builder, and provide fast feedback if they're creating something that is ultimately going to be non-compliant later down the road, right? That's how we approach that scalability that JR mentioned, and this sort of idea of managing our costs while also trying to bolster and ensure compliance.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I want to pick on one of the things Nick said about testing and how do you, so one thing I'm very interested in is, so you have, rigor around implementing, verifying, et cetera, but how do you automate it? I heard you say you automate testing because it's a continuous loop, right? Things are changing. We at AWS are innovating and changing things under you. The specifications change, the regulations change. So in this ever-changing environment, how do you stay on top of it, and how does automation help?
No, certainly. I think it is a challenge, and we're continually, I think it looks at what's the end-to-end life cycle or process, right? In terms of deploying a capability, deploying then the usage of those capabilities from an application perspective, and then those capabilities actually working together. Right, and so really what we're doing is we're creating what is the secure model. I think we were talking earlier, you call them blueprints, right? We're starting to come up with our own nomenclature around that. So starting with a reference architecture, what is the, what we call the secure hardening specs and capabilities around it, and then what are the use cases of each one, because it varies, it's not standalone. And this is where we see a lot of the nuances as new use cases arrive. And then what's the interoperability between these capabilities? And we have so many divergent use cases. Some could be pure cloud native applications. Others are very large platform ETL-based applications, and others are going back on-prem. So looking at those macro scenarios, how do you start building in the right control requirements in all of those scenarios? And then from an automation perspective, once we're able to continually develop what we call control implementation statements that are then tested. We have a kind of an internal capability we call the Fannie Mae automation control testing or FACT, which is really just leveraging all the capabilities within AWS and other tools to help us continually verify how we're doing against those reference architectures and control implementation statements, both in the lower environments and in production. But it's an ongoing process. And then the other aspect to it, we recognize that every time we introduce a new test has a ripple effect everywhere. And so having a process and a life cycle for how do you introduce those tests is also really important as part of this process.
So Carl, I see you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to hear that. And we take a bit of a similar approach. Our reference architectures exist, but we also focus heavily on the services themselves. Every service that we use in Amazon before it's allowed to be turned on gets an architecture review, it gets a risk review. We take a look at what are the edges that might rise above our risk tolerance if used in a certain way. And we've got a team that actually codifies a number of rules that prevent those services from being created in a way, or attempt to prevent those services from being created in a way that expose those edges that we can't tolerate. For us, it actually starts with identity and access management. Our group owns all of IAM, so the engineering community can't touch an IAM role. They can't build their own. They don't have the permission to do it in the environment. And this affords us a tremendous amount of control and the first point for us to inject our automation. When an engineer needs to change an identity and access management policy, give a policy to a resource, or change a role, they have to submit a pull request with their policy to what we affectionately refer to as our role bot. We have a role bot and a policy bot. It's an automated tool that looks for a number of conditions that help us meet the baseline compliance for the environment, for the workloads in question. But very similar to the blueprints, right? We're building out, these are the ways that it's acceptable to use this service, the ways that aren't acceptable, and then we work diligently. We have a team whose job it is to try to make it impossible to use those services in an unsanctioned way.
Yeah, and I would love to add to that. So I always use analogy when I talk about the blueprints. Like I said, as coming up as an engineer, one thing as engineers, what we typically do is we think whatever we build is better than the next engineer or whatever they built. So the analogy I always give is when you think about moving into the cloud, you got to think like a city planner. You're building a city in the cloud. And when you're building a city in the cloud, you want to build the most efficient city possible. And typically within organizations that are moving into the cloud, most engineers want to build all custom built homes. Take some time to build custom built homes. You won't move as fast. So what you want to think about is what I call apartments. You want to have a mixed community. It's not going to be all custom built home. It's not going to be all apartments. You're going to have a mixed community. But the apartments is the way your ability to be able to scale up in the organization and move it relatively rapidly, so you don't have every engineer trying to build custom built homes. The way to think about the apartments is think about yourself. If you are the landlord and you own an apartment building, you do not want every tenant installing their own light fixture, stove, oven, dishwasher. Absolutely not, because you're legally held liable. So you want licensed professionals to install those items, which then become amenities in the apartment. And then by those things being installed consistently the same way, guess what? As a landlord, if something breaks, I know exactly how to fix it and how to scale it up to my other 500 apartments in a very consistent way. 2, now the actual tenants can move in and take advantage of those amenities. Just like an engineer can then move in and the only thing they have to focus on is their business logic. There's only but a handful of reference architectures. In all the 25 years that I've been doing engineering, microservices, you got different flavors, event-based, serverless, just a standard. Data lakes, data processing, machine learning, AI. You're a combination of one of those things, right? If you build reference architectures that are aligned to those blueprints with security controls baked in, so this is where at JPMC we've shifted to this model. We're using Terraform to do infrastructure as code. Those are infrastructure blueprints. To build these reference architectures. They are not overly opinionated. I literally had to explain that to the engineers because they thought they really was different and we were like stopping them from being able to build. But at the end of the day, when you're building a microservices architecture, there always is a common set of services that you need bare minimum. Kubernetes, I need the load balancer, I need a container registry, I need network security, I want a service mesh, I want an optional database. I want to optionally pick what EC2 instances I want to use. Why would you have every engineer build that over and over again? This is where you get consistency. This is where you get automation, which then helps you to speed up your ability to get into the cloud with some level of standardization around how you're building those workloads into the cloud.
I mean, I'd like to piggyback
Please.
on what JR said. I think that's really key, right? We've kind of employed the same strategy. We have the deployment architecture is what we call it, right? And so that's sort of your starting point. We're starting to standardize on some terminology is what is the horizontal level, which is kind of the common level of things that are getting deployed, which they can't touch. This is your networking construct, your IAM policies, things of that nature, and then then logging and monitoring. You just get it. You inherit those things, and then we have the next layer, which is kind of the what we call the verticals that go on top of the horizontals, which is application specific, but it's still managed through right now, the product catalog and the CloudFormation templates. We are starting to deploy Terraform and moving in that direction to allow greater flexibility. So that is the approach. And then the last piece is the application piece, which is really challenging, right? So as you get all three layers, you have the horizontal piece, the vertical piece, and then the application-specific context of it is the next area we're trying to apply that same logic. It's much more difficult, much more challenging.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think that's where I think as companies you have to be careful.
Yeah.
You learn by doing.
Yeah.
And you don't want to over-opinionate for the engineer. So you want to give some level of autonomy, especially at the application layer.
Agreed.
And I think it's the infrastructure blueprint where you have that commonality. And then when you build the application on top, whether you're building a serverless or event-based, to your point, there's so much nuance there that you want to be careful not to over-opinionate and really lock the developer down. Because when you go into the cloud, the way I always say it, it's a continuum. You're either on the far left, where it's a concierge service and everything is centralized, and you actually have to help the application teams to move into the cloud. That engineer feels very locked down. At JPMC, the size of the company doesn't scale. Then you might want to be to the far right, where you have security guardrails and you give the engineers all the autonomy in the world, but you better make sure you got your guardrails right and you have auto remediation there, because that can lead to a disastrous of getting breached or something occur. We can't afford that to happen to JPMC. So we're in the middle where we get these infrastructure blueprints that we started. We started concierge, we now moved to the middle and building these infrastructure blueprints. But I truly believe it's never one size fit all. So we do have some to the right where we have very experienced engineers that we work very closely with, that there are some guardrails and they can operate in that way. We have some teams that's far to the left. And then the blueprints allow us to be able to really focus on probably, I would say 40-60% of the company can fit within those infrastructure blueprints, so you can move quickly and take advantage of what the cloud actually has to offer.
Fascinating. I've never heard this analogy with apartments and buildings. What a storyteller. Simplifying security and compliance down to like 101. That's pretty amazing. I just want to ask a follow-on question on that. I get, as we've evolved from like EC2 instances to EKS, ECS, and now serverless with Lambda functions, et cetera, what I hear you say is you can create these blueprints that span across all of them, because no matter your abstraction layer for compute, as an example, the foundations are always going to stay the same, and you can have those controls, putting them in the apartment bucket, for instance. Yeah. And as you get higher up the stack, it gets more complicated because applications differ, et cetera. Do you see, I know this wasn't part of my script, but I'm going to ask anyway, do you see a time when the evolution, just as it has happened in storage or compute and others, getting to upstack applications? I would love your thoughts on that.
Well, I would say absolutely. I mean, we already seen it within JPMC. We have some teams where so I think of it like Legos. You actually described it. You kind of have your foundational, how you do your organization units, how do you build an isolation zones is what we call it. Then you have that next layer where you then have pretty much your infrastructure blueprints. And then the next layer up is where you then may have actual platforms.
Yeah.
This is where in certain lines of businesses, like our CIB, consumer investment banking, how they process payments, they've built a platform that sits on top of the microservices infrastructure blueprint, because they want to have further opinionation of how their workloads gets deployed in a very consistent way. So I do believe as you move up that stack, but I think depending on the line of business, they can develop a platform that further opinionates and drive consistency in reference to how their business operates. What I don't see is actually trying to take that opinionation across the entire company.
Yep.
I think it's a misnomer. I think it's like, I always say, you think it's the North Star, but it's the South Star that doesn't exist. Don't try to do it, because I think you'll fail miserably. So you have to really pay close attention to when you want to do a further opinionation. But I think it's important you learn by doing. Don't be too quick. As technologists, I think we think technology solves everything. So we'll go, if we build it, they will come, and then you quickly realize that they don't come, and you need to start over again. So you really want to work with your business to see where it makes sense to build that opinionation on top of it.
And Carl, you said you have 3 pillars, right, at John Deere. How would something like that translate? Either within one of them or across? Do you see any commonalities?
Yeah, I do, and your comments resonated with me, JR. We do have a group, that advanced technology group that I was talking about, that probably has transcended the blueprints and the infrastructure piece to build a platform. We produce a platform that others in the ag industry can come and work and consume our products, building their own software and services. So I absolutely see that, but there are other lines of business where we do need to have a little stronger opinion, I think, in your vernacular. And we see that playing out right now, and we see that playing out through some of the controls, the automation that we're implementing. We always hear the word guardrails, and one of the analogies that comes to my mind is if you're driving down the road on the Autobahn, there's guardrails there, but you probably really don't want to hit those. And so one of the things we do is we try to keep track of who's bouncing off the guardrails, and that helps us understand maybe we do need to be a little bit more opinionated in this group or for these sets of workloads and applications. But yeah, absolutely resonates. I think any company at scale, you'll see this spectrum of not only capability, just knowledge and awareness in terms of tech, but also in terms of cybersecurity. That's what I pay attention to every day is trying to find the bad guys and trying to help our engineers go as fast as they can without making silly mistakes.
So one other question for you, specific coming from AWS. I've heard a lot of the common themes from all 3 of you. How do you actually leverage AWS services? We have a lot of them, and I'm curious what portions of those do you use, and how do you use them? Because each configuration is different, right? You said within your own, you have some teams saying, I use EKS, and others want to go serverless. So no matter where you are, and actually I'd really love to understand, in the context of hybrid environments where you have on-prem and the cloud, how does this work? How would any of you start?
I mean, I'll go first. Certainly there's a whole process. We call them, we actually call them formally technical capabilities as they come in, so all of the AWS services. And then we start off with the high-level reference architecture in terms of how they can be used, and then we start building in standardized configurations, at least in cloud formation templates and deployments up to a certain level, right? Then there's obviously the application-specific usages of it, and that's kind of where we're focusing next. So, we kind of have the standardized, how do we secure, harden let's say the technical capabilities, but then the nuances is all the use cases of the different apps and how they're using it, but then also all the capabilities they're interacting with as well. And so how do we make sure we create the right models so we can secure those use cases? And I think it really comes down to understanding those use cases, right? I don't think they're infinite. There should be some, there should be some kind of 80-20 rules, what we're thinking in terms of the use cases that are being used. And so we can focus in on those and making sure those are done securely. We're able to automate most of those configurations and how they're used, and even extend what I would call the app-specific parameters in those cases. And you still have the underlying constructs that are the same, but allow the application parameters to change, if you will, within some guardrails is one approach. The other aspect you mentioned, hybrid environments, that's certainly been a challenge for us.
For all of us.
Yes. and so you think about on-prem to AWS, but then you also look at the fact that our architectures, we have the whole spectrum. Some of our apps are, full microservices based, API based, and the other end is, we have, let's say monoliths that are, massive ETL based jobs that have to happen that run our business. And so the way we're dealing with it right now is we're actually creating a specialized environment to do lift and shift for some of those older legacy architected apps, so we can leverage the benefits of the cloud, but at the same time contain them into their own environment and how they integrate back into our more, I'd say, mature architected applications. We can control those, right, a little bit better to mitigate the potential risk or hazards with some of the legacy architectures.
Yeah, and I would add add to that. A couple of things, and I'm kind of go from the bottom foundation stack on up, and then kind of give an example of one of the blueprints two blueprints that we're building out right now. So, because we're hybrid, we have to be hybrid. You're talking, years of applications within JPMC. You're not going to hit the easy button and everything just moves over into the cloud. So you have to think hybrid. But in how you build out your ecosystem, you want to build it in such a way it doesn't frustrate the engineers, but you're still making sure you have the guardrails there that they can actually bump up against. And JPMC, as on this journey, some of that friction has been there, and rightfully so, because it's a transformation as you're making this journey. So the first layer, as Nick just pointed out, in reference to how you think about your foundational components, in reference to your organizational units, your service control policies, how you structure those organizational units is really important. Don't rush and not think about that structure, because that's what's going to allow you to, as Nick just pointed out, to be able to do some isolate certain workloads, or based on HIPAA or other type of requirements, you can now start figuring out how you want to build out your isolation zones while still giving autonomy to your actual engineers. That foundation is critically important. How do you think about your east to west traffic and your north to south? Now with VPC sharing, becomes much easier in how you're able to build out your network layer within your foundation and isolate your SDLC, right? Your tests, your dev, and your production. So that's like key. As you move up into the blueprints, this is where we get into like microservices, which I mentioned, Kubernetes, and some of the services that we're using in that. But the other one I would mention, we also have machine learning and AI. So this is where we leverage SageMaker as much as possible. We do use strategic partners from AWS. We're looking at like Databricks to be able to do machine learning and AI. Now, a critical piece, remember I told you we have over 450 petabytes of data. One of the critical pieces is how do we move our data into the cloud? So go back to that city analogy. When you build a city, what is the most precious resource to that city? It's the water. The most precious resource to your city in the cloud is your data. Most companies look at one-dimensional with their data, with their workloads, which is cost savings. Don't do that. You want to look at cost savings, business value, last one, data reuse. If you're not careful, you lay your pipes, one pipe, then you got to blow your city up, because now you got to think about how to lay your other pipes, and any cost savings you thought you had, you just lost. So with data, this is where in JPMC we've shifted to, I presented in the last re:Invent last year, thinking about a data mesh architecture. How do I build data as products so I can share the data across the lines of business, but do it in a federated way with autonomy, with security and controls. This is where we're using AWS Lake Formation to be able to put that layer on top of S3. If you've built data lakes in the cloud before, that's the hardest piece to get fine-grained entitlements. With Lake Formation, now it easily integrates with other managed services that are available to you, so Athena, Redshift, and on top of our machine learning AI blueprint. So guess what? We don't have to copy data. Most breaches happen because data gets copied and then the same controls are not followed. Boom, you got a breach. So let's reduce the amount of data copying by actually accessing the data right in place. This is what Lake Formation actually gives you the capability to be able to do, right? And it's evolving and it's growing in reference to finer grain entitlements, governed tables, and all the things that comes with Lake Formation. And then the next thing that's important as part of our data strategy is compliance and auditing. So this is where we started to look at a POC, and we're looking to move forward of how we use Audit Manager. How do I automate my controls for the cloud and data as part of our data mesh or data blueprint? So this is where we're looking at mapping our custom controls, Archer, into the actual AWS config rules and Audit Manager. Think of provision, manage, monitor, remediate, assure. Our provision, that's our data, that's our blueprints. Now we can have preventative controls where infrastructure as code that actually gets deployed, controls baked in. It's immutable infrastructure, you can't change it. Once it lands, let's just say it's an S3 bucket, private, Can't change it, it lands. Now with Audit Manager, we can monitor the actual control that was set in that blueprint from a preventive perspective. And still, this is the preventive aspect of now Audit Manager is running config rules to monitor to make sure that that remains in compliance. And that evidence gets collected. Then as you move into monitor, this is where we built our own tools on top of some open source that allows us to proactively monitor in our dev and our non-production environments, where if that bucket gets flipped for some reason, gets auto-remediate, gets flipped back to actual private, but the evidence is sent to Audit Manager. And then that's your auto-remediation, and then you get to assurance. So this is where we work closely with our second and third line of defense, and we did this POC, and we mapped the controls. All the evidence is getting sent to Audit Manager, and now we can actually produce reports without having to manually go produce that evidence and feed it to our downstream systems. We have our own audit system that our second and third line of defense works with. This is something we want to bake in day one, because if you're able to bake in this level of compliance that's fully automated at scale, now you can really shift your resources to not spending the time to manually go collect those controls. You can shift your cyber and your risk professionals in a way that you can get a greater return on your investment, where they're focused on being more proactive than being reactive. So those are some of the services that we're leveraging and using with JPMC.
Pretty incredible. And I do want to say, I'm sure all of you know, 90% of our roadmap comes from customers such as yourself. So when you say, lake formation, and I could hear you say, and we're working on, and I presume you're working with the lake formation team.
Absolutely.
And I would encourage the audience as well. We really do rely on customers such as yourself. So.
And just to share, like we worked, to your point, there were certain things like EMR didn't natively integrate with lake formation. The way AWS structured their teams, it's a catch-22. So you have the separate product team, so that's why every year they can release so many services. But then sometimes there's disconnects, but that's the trade-off. But the nice thing with the customer obsession, because AWS works very closely with customers, this is where we've pushed on features in lake formation that were not there. Like EMR wasn't natively integrated, now it is. Or we're pushing AWS, which then helps us to speed up on our journey.
Yep.
So absolutely.
I want to reiterate that, yep. So one thing I heard you say, which resonated from the keynote this morning, is think about security in the context of security, build it into the pipeline. And I heard you say the same thing about compliance, like build it into your pipeline and try to remove human interference as much as possible. I would love to hear your thoughts on how has that helped your, ultimately we're talking about business outcomes, especially you, I would love to start with you, Carl. How does all of this compliance and auditing, automation, building that early into your pipeline help you in your, ultimately in your business outcomes? Obviously, you have all these, we talk tactics.
For me, I think the simple answer is speed. And maybe to steal JR's analogy a little bit, if we're building a city and we've built up an apartment, and then after it's all built, we go through and we look at the apartment building and realize that it's failing 100 different compliance checks and it's uninhabitable. It costs a lot of money to tear that down, and you got a lot of frustrated engineers. It's a horribly expensive equation. And so one of the things we really focus on is building automation. The only way that we can scale is to have enough automation in place that allow our engineers to run fast and avoid making silly mistakes that would cost us a lot in the long run. And so we focus very heavily. I already mentioned the work that we do with IAM. I've just put a plug out there. If you're a security team and you don't own IAM, go find out why. You should. We focus on IAM. We get a lot of our control there. I think JR mentioned SCPs, so that's a key portion of just making it impossible to do the wrong thing out of the gate. We also have worked to enable our engineers to run fast by creating these guardrails that are sort of consumable, right? They can go and get guidance, they can understand. I mentioned this robot, the robot provides them feedback. No, you're not allowed to do this, but if you make these changes to your policy, then this will pass. The final thing, I guess I would say, in the enabling the business outcomes, which are speed, through automation on the security front, is something we use called Arrow. We built, it's a bit of a ProServe / product that AWS offered. It's kind of now being sunset. Those things that we can't prevent the creation of, that we can't protect with IAM, rather than scan 3 months, 1 month, 2 weeks later, rather than wait for an auditor to come up, Arrow is looking at CloudTrail for us, looking for things that we wouldn't expect to see in the environment, things that violate our policy. And my team calls it's a hammer. We have a bag of hammers that come out, and as soon as non-compliant infrastructure is created, we hope that it doesn't get created, but AWS, there's still some room to grow in our journey in terms of both AWS's capabilities and our own to prevent it from being created. If it's created, we want to get it hammered out of the environment almost immediately. And if we're following good SDLC, we start in a dev environment, we move to a quality environment, we finally move to production, you'll get hammered quick in dev and it won't be all that impactful. So really that's how I think about enabling speed, is through providing engineers as early feedback as possible. And as we look forward, we're trying to get even sharper on that. In our production environments, everything is mandatorily described as code. It's IAC. No humans are allowed to touch things in a productive environment, which necessitates code, which is inherently auditable. We can understand the infrastructure, how it complies. We're looking at more and more, even earlier in the pipeline, as that IAC templates are being built, validating those against our control policies, all in the name of speed. We want to be able to run fast, and when we can run safely, that's when we can go the fastest, because nothing slows a team down more than having a bad day with a security incident.
I think building in compliance into the CI/CD pipeline or the pipeline itself is critical. I'll give you an example of something we're going through, and I think everybody can relate. One is, obviously, we're migrating to the cloud in a very rapid pace. Something like almost 80% of our applications are now in the cloud. We're enabling a new set of data scientist use cases, right? They're running ML, they're creating new data science algorithms that require them to pull production data basically and do things with production data in real time and make changes back into production. We're in a landscape where the board decided to make our security posture more stringent. So the actual risk posture that companies willing to take actually became more stringent. And then on top of that, we have the regulatory landscape with all of the privacy laws also changing on us, becoming a lot more difficult. So if all of these things happening at the same time can't be achieved, right? We can't we can't get a more stringent security posture, enable these AI use cases, as well as continue these migrations to the cloud without really building in the compliance within the pipeline itself. Because there's just no way these, what would used to be point-in-time compliance checks or audit checks, obviously they still happen. It just won't support our business and everything else that we need to do. So we are on the journey. We're not fully there yet, but building in those the control testing within the pipeline itself, the other compliance testing at the various levels, I think it's key. And I don't think literally, if all these things happening, we would have just come to a halt, right? Otherwise, right? And the only way to keep moving is to build it into the pipeline and keep improving what we're able to test from a compliance standpoint within the pipeline itself. And then lastly, I think a really good point is that audit trail is there always, right? We don't have to pull reports and demonstrate. It's always there.
Yeah, and I think one thing I would just add in reference back to some of the benefits that we saw is having the infrastructure as code, Terraform, blueprint. So it's not a diagram that's on the intranet. It's something that engineers actually can install. But in that blueprint, a couple of things we saw where engineers, it was taking them months, sometimes some weeks, getting it down to hours of actually being able to provision their infrastructure. That improves your ability, your team's time to market, and builds trust with your business. Because a lot of time the business thinks, as technologists, we're just playing with our toys and we're not helping them to deliver business value. So speeding the teams up is important. Two, we have a very rigorous process that engineers have to go through to onboard their applications into the cloud. A lot of that was manual. So there's actual security controls they have to meet. So we wanted to automate some of those controls. It's never 100%. And we're still on this journey. I think there's opportunity. We probably can get more controls, but we actually have Sentinel policies and within our foundational services baked in. So if a team is leveraging this blueprint, then it runs Sentinel policies and it matches the controls. So now within their onboarding process, it speeds up their ability to get through the approvals, which also increases their ability to speed to market. And then I think lastly, the thing that I think is really important, and this is aspirational, we're not there yet, and this is the journey part, is when you start thinking about machine learning and AI, that's really for JPMorgan and Chase in reference to competing with fintechs, is how we're going to reimagine ourselves, getting insights into that data, coming up with new digital products, creating new experiences. Well, what's important is the actual machine learning, the data sciences experience. I know at JPMC, to actually get the data, you need an engineer, then they have to stage the data, and then go through the normal things that you have to go as a data scientist. If that takes a very long time, markets moved on. So this is why we're trying to build this data mesh strategy with data as products that allows us, you got data use, whether I can use that data, all those things where data can remain where it's at, and tiling the data, which is just done through lake formation. So now that you don't have to have a data engineer actually have to land the data and curate the data, as we can speed up the data speed. So democratize the data, increase our data speed with the right governance and control. And that's the tricky part, because what we don't want to do is introduce new friction as a result of putting the guardrails. And that's a slippery slope. It's very difficult to do. And this is where I was just saying, I'm curious to hear from both of you. This is where I think it's more than just technology. Yeah. This is where the transformational aspect comes into play with people, because you got to have the right people with the right growth mindset who are educating themselves. They understand the business, they understand where the skeletons are at, but now they're taking a new way of thinking and applying that and helping the organization to make that transformational shift. And that's where you get the slippery slope of your governance and your controls and your compliance, making sure you're not reintroducing friction to the overall process. And it's not an easy thing to do. It's very difficult to do, but curious to hear both of your viewpoints.
Cool.
Especially as it relates to org changes or not, or retooling.
Sure. It's a hard question. No, I think fundamentally I agree. As I think through the statement, though, I think one of the most important things we can do is just educate our engineers about cloud. My teams will say clouding is hard. And as a security function, we are necessarily spread across all of the services, and we see all of the hard ways in which things come together. And so I agree, it's not just about technology, it's about people. But as we focus on people, helping them understand that the true operation and differentiators that the cloud brings, AWS offers myriad amazing services that can be put together in so many ways to drive value at an incredible pace. We have to shift mindsets of developers and engineers, and for me, that's the first piece on the people journey. Maybe even before the security and compliance culture, just understanding what capabilities exist in the cloud and how it's so much different. There's probably not a centralized group that's going to spin up your Oracle database, right? You're going to have to go and figure out what kind of RDS am I using and understand the way that things connect. And so, to me, that's the imperative as we continue to migrate toward the cloud, helping everybody from the junior engineer all the way through the senior architect that maybe hasn't had that exposure or doesn't understand the value prop of the cloud, ephemerality of workloads, getting that education, getting those people sort of aware at least of all of the nuance and potential complexity that exists. That gives rise to really rich conversations and can generate a pull. Okay, tell me more. Now help me figure out how to secure this. I don't know, that's my off the cuff on the question.
Oh, well done.
I think very similar, obviously. I think the challenge we're seeing, and I'm sure everybody is seeing it, is that compliance, and we talked about this before we started, is the baseline. It's like the bare minimum, right? And I think shifting that mindset where, compliance is the bare minimum, but we're here to secure our organization, right? And so we're able to put in controls, guardrails, or find things that improve that, and it's not part of our compliance regime, or it's not there yet, it doesn't mean it doesn't need to be done, right? And I think that's a big shift. And I think the reason the cloud introduces complexity to this shift is really to do that correctly, is to do it at all layers, right? You've got to do that foundational layer, the platform layer, and the application layer, because they all work together. And really, that's really tough for people. At least historically, organizations were divided by infrastructure, platform, and app. And now you're looking at all three and how they're interconnected, and how do you apply the right security controls and monitor them and adhere to them, and have a process that allows us to discover, oh yeah, the app deployed it this way. Oh, by the way, that actually breaks some of our least privilege, or that actually breaks some of our access out to the internet. But that's not explicitly written in a compliance statement somewhere, right? And so I think it's that cultural change, is how do we work together to recognize that we are going to continually find security weaknesses as we deploy new services, new configurations, and as we do that, how do we quickly introduce that back into the SDLC, into the mindset of it, and that it's everybody's responsibility. The other challenge that we're breaking down is, oh, that's compliance. We have an organization, an internal organization that does compliance checks, right? Well, that's their job. Why do I have to be worried about it? No, you're the security expert. That's your job. And so, there's a lot of that type of breaking down barriers. Everybody has to be focused on security in all manners. It's just how do you create that tight loop process to make it effective. It's something we're still struggling with, to be honest with you.
I think everybody is. But if I could just piggyback a little bit too, as I thought about compliance in this conversation here, ultimately to me, compliance is a byproduct, an outcome of a secure and resilient organization, right? Especially if we're then feeding that data back into things like Audit Manager, where you can just go and have clear visibility to compliance. I would love to see us just make compliance just a thing that happens automatically, and obviously we get alerted when it's not there, but if we are truly focused on being secure and being resilient, I think compliance comes along for the ride if we're connecting things up correctly.
It's the same philosophy we use at AWS. Build it into every engineer, starting with the SDE1 all the way to the architects and DEs. Then it becomes culture. And of course, there are, to your point about guardrails, there's a central team that's building the blueprints and making sure that there's processes, et cetera. But ultimately, you want a culture where it's already ingrained rather than an afterthought, and you're looking at someone else to put the guardrails for you, so to speak. So I heard you say a little bit about continuous auditing. At least you have that in the parts where you are further ahead and more, custom versus your on-prem, and the cost benefits of having the continuous audit. I'd like you to expand a little bit more on that, because that's something I'm sure a lot of people deal with, right? We don't live in a land where, sure they do spot checks, but continuously auditing yourself keeps it efficiently running. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so, well, I think that's one thing where we're trying with our data mesh architecture. We're starting there with around controls around our data, and also from a cloud perspective. And with the around the manage and the monitor, along with the provision. So we actually have Terraform that we've created that creates our producing accounts. That's to create a data product. And then we have Terraform that creates the consumption accounts, where you may consume the data through Athena, Redshift. And then we have Terraform around our central lake formation account. So each line of business can create their own federated data lake. So that's fully automated, and we're baking as much controls into that. And when that gets deployed with Audit Manager, this is where with our federated data lake, if we build up and have AWS Audit Manager up and running for all of our federated data lakes, then the actual controls around our data and cloud for our federated data is continuously, the evidence is collected. So within our second and third line of defense, let's say our third line, they can go in and do an audit, and literally we're going to feed that to our downstream audit system that actually can then go and focus on the areas that need to focus versus spending all that time actually collecting the evidence. And then we see the opportunity with our second line of defense, because now it's like a la carte. They can now pick and choose what controls they possibly want to look at, and the evidence has already been collected. So this is where, as we roll this out, we're in the early stages of this. We believe we can apply this to our other workloads as well, our other blueprints as well. But this is where we see a huge benefit in reference to, really for us, it becomes a competitive advantage. So if you look at the fintechs, a lot of the fintechs for us that we compete with, they don't really build things that has to do with the regulatory aspects of the bank. They put the veneer on top, right? Now, for us to keep up, we need to get really good at continuous audit and compliance so then we can level the playing field. And if we level that playing field, then that's going to allow us to really then compete with these
That's
fintechs.
great from a business outcome, as well as, I think, based on the outliers and behavior patterns,
Yes.
using the data and machine learning,
Absolutely.
you can then soften and graduate certain teams to easier
No, absolutely.
things like that. So I
Yeah.
think there's lots of ways you can take this, and of course I didn't think about the business outcome, and it gives you an edge.
And only last thing I want to add, so even down within our audit team, they do machine learning and AI on top of the data that they get collected.
That's what I meant, yeah.
Right, exactly, to
Yeah.
give insight into where they need to be actually spending their time at, to make sure that we're focused.
The teams that have more outliers than the
Yeah,
others and so
absolutely,
on. So yeah, it's multi-pronged. So I know we're running out of time. I would love each of you to wrap up with, where do you think this is going? Reinforce is dedicated to security, compliance, auditing, and things like that. As a collective in this journey of cloud operations, I would love each of you to spend a minute or two on, where do you think we're headed? What does the future look like?
You want to go first? Start over there.
I think the future is bright. I hope that as we sort of continue, Amazon keeps partnering with us to help us understand what the roadmaps look like, where the services are headed, and what are the most, we had a great conversation last night about maybe some of the most common pitfalls or caveats in services, some of the most common security holes, and that they're helping us bake into some of these compliance regimens, some abilities to automate. Security Hub, for example, AWS best practices is an amazing thing. That's part of our journey, and that's kind of us moving up stack. We had a really great story with CISL2 going from a relatively low level of compliance to a higher level. That was the only capability at the time. Now AWS has rolled out best practices. And what's wonderful about that is that it's AWS's guidance on how best to build a secure environment on top of all of the other controls that we're going to keep doing. On top of things like audit as a service is what we call it, making that evidence just discoverable by the auditors. I think where we're headed, I think it's bright, and I think where we're headed is more prescriptive guidance from AWS that's codified into the tools themselves with the knobs and dials that our teams can use to automate a truly resilient environment that meets the needs of the business, enables the engineers to run quickly, but also prevents silly mistakes from happening.
So recipes.
You got it.
Yep, okay.
Sure. Really just to piggyback off Carl, I think, agree with all of that. I think really the partnership with AWS in reference to improving their services, but also with other strategic partners, like with Databricks, where there are some advantages, Snowflake, how do you integrate entitlements with those services so you don't have entitlements across very different systems. That also helps to improve how you really start to look at recipes that you can build in a very consistent way that allows you to be able to have continuous compliance and automation. I think the other thing I think is really important is, like AWS, you're seeing so many different customers. And so you have that line of sight that you can help build these recipes. I know that's a little slippery slope because you don't want to be too opinionated.
You don't want to be too opinionated.
But finding that right sweet spot, I think that can help. So when you come in, you're just not completely starting from scratch, right? And then the last thing I would just say, I think what's really important, and which I think everyone touched on, and I love what Nick said, is it's everyone's responsibility. And I think this is where even what we're trying to do, educating your finance team, educating your audit team, your compliance team, the more and more of your organization is actually educated, you really get collective intelligence, and it drives that momentum to drive the transformation forward with everything that you're trying to do from a continuous compliance and audit perspective.
No, real quick. I think one from the keynote is that provable security, right? I think that's a really important concept. And one thing I'd like to see, and I'm hoping we could see, is how do we? It's not just after the fact, but how do we take those provable declarative statements and make them from the beginning, right? Starting with the design to the actual provisioning of the capabilities, then obviously validating once it's deployed. I think that's the key challenge, that opportunity, because I think it's possible, right? As well as, and maybe that's where the recipes come into play. And then I think that's the opportunity. The other aspect of it, and I know we're out of time real quick, is how do we take care of all layers of that stack, right? In that model, from all the way from the left all the way to the right. I think that's the other opportunity for us, because I think that's where we need to go.
Excellent. Thank you all. I want to thank all the panelists for imparting their words of wisdom, and it really resonates with me. So if any of you have suggestions, ideas, things we could be doing in this space, please reach out, and we're more than happy to do our part in this journey toward easier compliance and continuous auditing. Thank you all for joining us today.